Hey guys, tonight the journey leads into the strange world of Roman gladiators, where men who occupied the absolute lowest ranks of society simultaneously achieved fame rivaling emperors, where enslaved fighters and condemned prisoners became objects of obsessive public fascination, and where the bloodiest entertainment Rome ever created produced cultural icons whose faces appeared on pottery, whose names were scratched into walls, and whose exploits were discussed in marketplaces across the empire. Before settling in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if there's genuine interest in what unfolds here. And let everyone know in the comments where the viewing is happening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see who's joining from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and ease into tonight's journey together. When modern minds imagine ancient Rome, certain images tend to surface. The Colosseum rising against the sky, armoured figures locked in combat, crowds roaring their approval or disapproval, emperors giving thumbs up or down to determine fates. These visions carry truth, certainly, but they represent only the most visible surface of a phenomenon that was far more complex, contradictory, and revealing about Roman society than the simple spectacle suggests. Gladiators occupied a unique and paradoxical position in Roman culture. They were legally classified as infames, a category of people without honour who couldn't vote, hold office or serve in the legions. They ranked alongside actors, prostitutes and pimps in social standing, which is to say they had essentially no respectable standing whatsoever. Most were enslaved people or condemned criminals who had no choice about their profession. They were considered polluted by their association with death and violence, tainted in ways that made them unsuitable for normal social intercourse. Yet these same men were simultaneously treated as celebrities in ways that modern people would find immediately recognisable. Their images appeared on lamps, pottery and wall paintings throughout the empire. Graffiti artists scratched their names and fighting records onto walls in Pompeii and other cities. Children played with miniature figurines of famous gladiators. Women of all social classes, including respectable married women, were rumoured to have affairs with gladiators despite the enormous social stigma. Gladiatorial games were among the most popular entertainments Rome ever created, drawing crowds of tens of thousands who followed favourite fighters with passionate devotion. This contradiction between gladiators' degraded legal and social status and their enormous popular fame reveals fundamental tensions in Roman society. The Romans simultaneously despised and desired gladiators, rejected them socially while embracing them culturally, condemned the institution while celebrating its products. Understanding how this paradox functioned illuminates Roman attitudes toward violence, entertainment, social hierarchy, masculinity, and the boundaries between civilized and savage behaviour. The gladiatorial games themselves were ancient by the time of the Roman Empire, with origins stretching back to Etruscan funeral practices and early Roman commemorations of the deceased. What began as human sacrifice at funerals, offerings of blood to honour the dead, evolved into elaborate spectacles where combat served both religious and entertainment functions. By the late Republic and Empire, gladiatorial games had become massive public entertainment staged by politicians seeking popularity, by emperors demonstrating generosity, and by wealthy individuals commemorating deceased family members while advancing their own reputations. The scale of these games could be staggering. The inaugural games for the Colosseum under the Emperor Titus in 80 CE supposedly lasted 100 days and featured thousands of gladiators. Later emperors sponsored games involving hundreds or even thousands of pairs of fighters. The economic investment was enormous, with the costs of purchasing, training, feeding, housing, and equipping gladiators representing substantial expenditure. Yet sponsors considered the investment worthwhile, because games brought political support, demonstrated wealth and power, and provided opportunities to display generosity to the masses. The popularity of gladiatorial combat reflected Roman values in complex ways. Romans valued martial virtue and military prowess as central to their identity. The disciplined violence of gladiatorial combat resonated with Roman military culture, providing civilian populations opportunities to witness idealized versions of Roman courage and martial skill. The contest also reinforced social hierarchies, with condemned criminals and enslaved people fighting for the entertainment of free citizens, demonstrating the power differential between those who watched and those who performed. Yet the Romans were also ambivalent about gladiators and gladiatorial combat. Philosophers and moralists criticised the games as brutal and corrupting. Some emperors expressed distaste for the spectacles even while sponsoring them. Respectable Romans maintained careful distance from the gladiatorial profession itself, even while attending games enthusiastically. The tension between attraction and repulsion, fascination and disgust, shaped how gladiators were simultaneously celebrated and stigmatized. Understanding gladiatorial celebrity requires examining multiple dimensions: the training system that created professional fighters, the amphitheater experience where fame was made and lost, the economics of the gladiatorial business, the sexual dimensions of gladiatorial appeal, the individual stories of famous gladiators whose names survived history, and the cultural legacy that outlasted the games themselves. Tonight's exploration begins not in the arena's bloody sand, but in the training schools where gladiators were made, examining the daily lives and professional development of men who had become Rome's most famous outcasts. From there, the journey leads into the amphitheater to understand the spectacle that created celebrity, explores the economics and business structures supporting the games, examines the complex sexual and romantic dimensions of gladiatorial fame, and considers individual gladiators whose stories illuminate the larger phenomenon. The goal isn't merely cataloguing the violence or celebrating the spectacle, but rather understanding the cultural and social dynamics that made gladiatorial celebrity possible, and revealing what this phenomenon shows about Roman civilization's values, anxieties, and contradictions. The gladiator stands at the intersection of multiple Roman concerns, about violence and civilization, about slavery and freedom, about honour and shame, about masculinity and sexuality, about entertainment and morality. So settle in, perhaps with appreciation for modern entertainment that doesn't require actual human destruction, and prepare to discover why Rome's most degraded men became its most celebrated celebrities. The journey reveals a society grappling with its own bloodlust, trying to contain and channel violence through ritual and spectacle, creating heroes from those it simultaneously condemned, and leaving a legacy that continues shaping how violence and entertainment intersect in popular culture. The journey to gladiatorial celebrity began not in the arena's glory, but in the Ludus, the gladiatorial training school where raw material, whether enslaved captives, condemned criminals, or rare volunteers, was transformed into professional fighters. These schools were simultaneously prisons, military barracks, and athletic training facilities where life was harsh but also structured, purposeful, and aimed at creating specialists in a brutal craft. Understanding the Ludus reveals how ordinary men became extraordinary fighters, and how that transformation laid the groundwork for their celebrity. Gladiators came to the profession through several paths, none of them particularly appealing. The majority were enslaved people, purchased by lanistae, the owners and managers of gladiatorial schools. These might be war captives, individuals enslaved for debt, or people born into slavery and sold into gladiatorial training as young men. Their enslavement was the foundation of their profession, with no choice involved in their path to the arena. Condemned criminals also swelled gladiatorial ranks. Those sentenced to the arena, ad gladium or ad ludum, faced death either immediately in staged executions, or eventually through gladiatorial combat. These damnati had forfeited their lives through serious crimes, with the arena representing a form of capital punishment disguised as entertainment. Their chances of survival were generally poor, as they lacked the training and motivation of professional gladiators. A small but significant minority were volunteers, free men who chose to enter gladiatorial service despite the social stigma. Called octorati, these individuals took binding oaths, the octoramentum, that essentially enslaved them for a set period, typically 5 years. Their motivations varied: desperate poverty, gambling debts, desire for the fame and potential rewards successful gladiators could earn, or in rare cases genuine martial passion. These volunteers were viewed with particular contempt by Roman society, as they voluntarily surrendered the freedom and honour that defined Roman citizenship. Regardless of how they arrived, all gladiators entered a world of strict discipline and intensive training. The Ludus was typically a fortified compound with high walls, guards, and secured quarters. The largest and most famous schools were in Rome itself, particularly the Ludus Magnus near the Colosseum. which was directly connected to the amphitheater by an underground tunnel. Other major cities throughout the empire maintained their own schools, creating a network of training facilities supplying gladiators for regional games. The physical layout of a ludus resembled military barracks combined with an athletic training facility. The central feature was the training ground, an open area often elliptical in shape, mimicking the arena where gladiators would eventually fight. This space allowed fighters to practice under conditions similar to actual combat. Surrounding this central area were cells where gladiators slept, typically small rooms housing 2 to 4 men. Archaeological excavations at Pompeii's gladiatorial barracks reveal cramped but not unbearable living conditions. The daily routine in the ludus was rigorous and exhausting. Training began at dawn and continued throughout the day, with only brief breaks for meals. The regimen focused on developing the specific skills needed for each type of gladiator, as there were numerous specialised fighting styles, each with its own equipment, tactics and techniques. A man wasn't simply trained as a generic gladiator, but as a particular type. Whether Mamillo, Secutor, Retiarius, Thraex, or one of several other categories. The training masters, called doctores, were typically retired gladiators who had survived long enough to gain freedom and transition to teaching. These men possessed intimate knowledge of combat techniques and the psychology of fighting. They taught not just physical skills, but also the mental discipline necessary to face death repeatedly. The relationship between doctor and student was intense, combining elements of military drill instructor, athletic coach, and sometimes mentor or even surrogate father. Initial training used wooden weapons, the rudis, and training posts, the palace. New gladiators spent countless hours striking these posts, developing proper form, building striking power, and creating muscle memory for movements that would have to occur instantly in combat. The palus work was repetitive and tedious but essential, transforming clumsy movements into efficient, deadly techniques. As skills developed, gladiators progressed to training with blunted weapons against other students. These practice bouts, supervised by doctores, allowed fighters to develop timing, strategy, and the ability to read opponents while minimizing serious injuries. Even blunted weapons could cause damage, however, and training injuries were common. The goal was to prepare men for real combat without depleting the school's valuable inventory of trained fighters. Different gladiatorial types required different training approaches. The Retiarius, or net fighter, used a weighted net, trident, and dagger, fighting without the heavy armour that protected other gladiator types. This fighter needed exceptional speed and agility, learning to cast the net while maintaining defensive mobility. The training emphasised quick footwork and the ability to recover if the net cast failed. The Secutor, literally pursuer, was designed specifically to fight the Retiarius. Equipped with heavy armour, large shield and short sword, the Secutor had to close distance with the mobile net fighter while avoiding entanglement. Training emphasised shield work, maintaining defensive posture, and the patience to wait for openings rather than rushing recklessly forward. The Mumia wore a large rectangular shield and helmet with a distinctive fish crest, carrying a short sword similar to the Roman legionary gladius. These gladiators trained in techniques resembling military combat, with emphasis on shield discipline and precise swordsmanship. The Mumillo often fought against the Thraex, another heavily armoured type with different equipment. The Thraex, or Thracian, used a small rectangular shield and a curved sword, the Seeker. The fighting style emphasised quick movements and strikes from unexpected angles, exploiting the curved blade's ability to reach around opponents' shields. The training developed mobility within the constraints of armour, and the ability to use the unusual weapon effectively. The Hoplomachus fought in Greek-inspired equipment with a spear as the primary weapon, combining elements of Greek hoplite warfare with gladiatorial combat. These fighters needed to master the spear for both throwing and thrusting while maintaining defensive capability if the spear was lost or broken. Each type had strengths and weaknesses, with matchups carefully designed to create dramatic contest between contrasting styles. The matchmakers, the editors who organised games, paired gladiators strategically to create compelling spectacles. The training in the ludus prepared fighters not just to execute their own style, but to understand opponents' typical tactics and exploit their vulnerabilities. Physical conditioning complemented technical training. Gladiators needed extraordinary strength, endurance, and pain tolerance. Weight training using lead or stone weights developed muscular power. Running built cardiovascular fitness. Wrestling created functional strength and taught grappling techniques useful in close combat. The overall physical development aimed at creating athletes capable of fighting multiple bouts in a single day if necessary, as games sometimes featured the same gladiators in sequential contests. The diet supporting this training was substantial and carefully managed. Gladiators consumed large quantities of food to fuel their training and build muscle mass. Barley and beans formed dietary staples, providing calories and protein. The gladiator diet was apparently high in vegetable protein, with meat appearing less frequently than might be expected for such physical training. This diet, while nutritious, was monotonous and utilitarian rather than pleasurable. Medical care in the Ludus was sophisticated by Roman standards. Gladiators represented significant financial investments, and owners wanted to protect their assets. The best gladiatorial physicians, called medici, developed advanced knowledge of traumatic injuries and wound care through constant practice, treating combat injuries. Galen, one of the ancient world's most famous physicians, began his career treating gladiators in Pergamon, gaining surgical experience that informed his later theoretical work. The psychological preparation for combat was as important as physical training. Gladiators had to overcome natural fear of injury and death, developing the ability to fight effectively despite mortal danger. The training cultivated a fatalistic acceptance of death combined with fierce will to survive. The famous gladiatorial salute, Ave Caesar, morituri te salutant, Hail Caesar, those who are about to die salute you, whether historically accurate or a later invention, expressed this mindset. Acknowledgement of mortality combined with determination to face it courageously. Discipline in the Ludus was strict and enforced through physical punishment. Gladiators who failed to train properly, who disobeyed orders, or who showed cowardice faced beating, food restriction, or confinement in punishment cells. The worst offenders might be relegated to inferior gladiatorial types, or assigned to certain death matches. The discipline created order in a potentially dangerous environment, where armed men lived in close quarters under stressful conditions. Yet the Ludus wasn't purely oppressive. Successful gladiators earned privileges and status within the school hierarchy. Veterans who had survived numerous bouts commanded respect from newer fighters. Those who showed exceptional skill might receive better quarters, superior food, and other benefits. The Ludus developed its own internal social structure, with hierarchies based on fighting record, skill, and seniority. Gladiators formed strong bonds with their Ludus mates, connections forged through shared hardship and danger. These men lived, trained, and often died together. The relationships could be intensely emotional, combining rivalry with brotherhood. Inscriptions and graffiti reveal that gladiators mourned deceased companions and celebrated survivors' victories. The Ludus became a kind of family, albeit one with high turnover due to combat deaths. Sexual relationships within the Ludus were probably common, though the evidence is indirect. The environment of young men living in close quarters with limited access to women, combined with the intense emotional bonds formed through shared danger, likely created situations where sexual relationships developed. Roman attitudes toward male sexuality were complex, with the penetrative partner maintaining masculine status, while the receptive partner faced stigma. How these dynamics played out in gladiatorial communities is unclear, but the intensity of the environment surely created various forms of intimacy. The transition from training to actual combat was carefully managed. New gladiators didn't immediately face experienced opponents in major games. They began with fights against other novices, tirocinii, where both fighters had limited experience. These early bouts occurred at smaller local games rather than major urban spectacles. The matchmakers protected valuable investments by ensuring new fighters gained experience gradually, rather than being destroyed immediately. Success in early bouts was crucial for developing a career. Gladiators who won their first several fights gained confidence and began building reputations. Those who lost but fought well might receive the missio, a grant of life despite defeat, allowing them to fight again. Those who showed cowardice or performed poorly might be dismissed without mercy, either dying in the arena or being relegated to certain death matches as punishment. The Ludus system created professional fighters through systematic training, conditioning, and psychological preparation. It transformed men from various backgrounds into specialists in armed combat, producing the athletes whose performances would enthrall millions across the empire. The harsh discipline, intensive training, and calculated development of skills created the foundation upon which gladiatorial celebrity was built. Understanding life in the Ludus reveals that gladiatorial combat wasn't random violence between untrained combatants, but rather skilled performances by professional fighters. The training and preparation invested in each gladiator made their eventual arena appearances all the more dramatic and made the best fighter's survival and success genuinely impressive. The celebrity that successful gladiators achieved rested on real skill and accomplishment, not merely luck or spectacle. The Ludus was where ordinary men, most stripped of freedom and dignity by enslavement or condemnation, found purpose and developed expertise. It was where they formed bonds with fellow fighters and where they prepared mentally for the possibility of dying publicly. It was the foundation of the gladiatorial system, the invisible structure supporting the visible spectacle that captivated Roman audiences and created celebrities from society's outcasts. The transformation from trained fighter to celebrated celebrity occurred in the arena, the public stage where gladiatorial skill met popular judgment. The amphitheater experience for both fighters and spectators was carefully orchestrated spectacle designed to maximize drama, emotion, and entertainment value. Understanding how games unfolded reveals the mechanisms through which some gladiators achieved fame, while others disappeared into obscurity or death. The day of the games began long before the first combat. Spectators arrived early to secure good seats, though seating was determined by social rank, with senators and equestrians occupying the best positions closest to the arena floor, while common citizens sat higher up. The poorer spectators crowded into the upper tiers or stood in the higher sections. This seating arrangement reinforced social hierarchies, making the games both entertainment and display of Roman social order. The amphitheater itself was an architectural marvel. The Colosseum in Rome, the most famous example, could hold between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators, depending on various estimates. The structure provided clear views from virtually every position, with the elliptical arena floor at the centre visible to all. The engineering allowed efficient movement of crowds, with numerous entrances and exits preventing dangerous bottlenecks. The building was designed specifically for its purpose, displaying violence to maximum dramatic effect. The arena floor, usually covered with sand to absorb blood and provide traction, concealed elaborate substructures. The hypodium, the network of tunnels and rooms beneath the arena floor, housed gladiators, animals, and equipment before their appearances. Sophisticated elevator systems brought fighters and animals up through trapdoors, creating dramatic entrances that added to the spectacle. The underground tunnels connected to external buildings, allowing movement of people and animals without public visibility before their arena moments. The games typically began with a procession, the pompa, where gladiators paraded before the crowd in elaborate costumes, displaying the armour and weapons they would use. This procession built anticipation while allowing spectators to examine the day's fighters and make informal bets on outcomes. The gladiators walked the arena perimeter, acknowledging the crowd and the presiding editor, the sponsor of the games who sat in the place of honour. Musical accompaniment heightened the drama. Horns, trumpets, and the hydraulis, a water organ, provided sound effects coordinated with the action. Different musical themes marked different parts of the programme, building tension before combats and celebrating victories. The sensory experience combined visual spectacle with carefully managed audio, creating an immersive entertainment environment. The actual gladiatorial combats didn't begin immediately. The morning typically featured animal hunts, venations, where professional hunters faced imported exotic animals. These spectacles demonstrated Roman power over nature, while providing warm-up entertainment before the main events. Midday brought the executions of condemned criminals, often staged as mythological or historical reenactments. Criminals might be costumed as mythological figures and subjected to the fates those characters suffered in myths. The gladiatorial combats themselves occurred in the afternoon, the highlight of the day's programme. The matchmakers paired fighters carefully, seeking to create compelling contests between roughly equal opponents with contrasting styles. A heavily armoured Mumio might face a mobile Retiarius, creating tension between the net fighter's speed and the sword fighter's protection. The contrasts made battles more dramatic than simple identical matchups would have been. Before fighting, gladiators underwent final preparations. Weapons were inspected to ensure they were sharp and properly weighted. Armour was checked for security. The fighters might receive final advice from doctors or massages to loosen muscles. This preparation occurred in the holding areas beneath the arena, moments of calm before the violence above. The entrance into the arena through trapdoors or gates marked the transition from preparation to performance. Gladiators emerged into sunlight, sound, and the focused attention of tens of thousands. The sensory shock must have been overwhelming. The brightness after underground dimness, the roar of the crowd, the vastness of the space, the immediate awareness that death might come within minutes. Those who had fought before knew what to expect. First-timers faced the terror of the unknown, added to combat's inherent dangers. The combats themselves followed patterns shaped by training and combat logic. Fighters began cautiously, testing each other's reflexes and searching for weaknesses. The initial probing might last several minutes, with little apparent action as gladiators circled and feinted. The crowd might grow restless during these slow phases, demanding more aggressive action. As combat intensified, the skilled gladiator demonstrated learned techniques. The retiarius cast his net, hoping to entangle his opponent. The secutor pressed forward behind his shield, trying to force close combat where his sword would be effective. Each movement reflected years of training, with split-second decisions determining outcomes. A successful net cast could end the fight immediately if the entangled fighter couldn't escape. A well-timed shield bash could create an opening for a decisive sword thrust. The crowd's reaction shaped combat dynamics. Spectators cheered favoured fighters and jeered those who disappointed. They shouted advice, warnings, and encouragement. The noise could be overwhelming, making it difficult for fighters to hear anything beyond the immediate sounds of combat. Yet gladiators learned to read crowd reactions, using their responses as feedback about performance quality. The physical demands were extraordinary. Combat in armour while wielding weapons quickly exhausted even the fittest athletes. The weight of equipment, the stress of mortal danger, and the explosive movements required all drained energy rapidly. Fights typically lasted between 10 and 20 minutes, though some extended longer if both fighters were skilled and cautious. The fatigue factor meant that conditioning and efficiency of movement were crucial survival skills. Wounds occurred frequently, ranging from minor cuts to serious injuries. A skilled gladiator tried to disable the opponent without immediately going for destruction, as a quick death might disappoint the crowd. The most celebrated combats involved skillful back-and-forth action, with both fighters showing courage and ability. The crowd wanted drama, not mere slaughter, and gladiators who provided entertainment through skillful fighting earned appreciation regardless of final outcome. When one fighter gained decisive advantage, the defeated gladiator could appeal for mercy. The traditional gesture was dropping or raising the weapon and extending one finger, asking the crowd and the presiding editor for the missio a grant of life. The fate of the defeated rested on multiple factors: how well he'd fought, whether he had shown courage, how popular he was with the crowd, and the editor's disposition and political calculations. The crowd expressed its judgment through gestures and shouts. The famous thumbs up or thumbs down gestures are actually modern inventions or misinterpretations of ancient descriptions. Romans apparently used different hand signals, possibly with the thumb hidden in the fist for mercy and extended for death, though the exact meanings are debated by scholars. Regardless of the precise gestures, the crowd made its preferences known loudly and clearly. The presiding editor made the final decision, though going against strong crowd sentiment was politically risky. Granting mercy to a crowd favourite who had fought well demonstrated magnanimity and won popular approval. Granting mercy too freely, however, cheapened the spectacle and could disappoint bloodthirsty spectators. Ordering death too readily might seem cruel and harm the editor's reputation. The decision required political judgment about how to please the audience while maintaining appropriate standards. When death was decreed, the victorious gladiator was expected to deliver it efficiently and with dignity. The defeated fighter was supposed to accept death courageously, maintaining composure and displaying the Roman virtue of meeting fate bravely. The actual moment of death was swift, usually a thrust to the throat or heart. After the fall, attendants dressed as Charon, the mythological ferryman of the dead, verified death and removed the body through the Porta Libertinensis, the Death Gate. Victory brought immediate rewards. The victor received the palm branch symbolising triumph, and often monetary prizes. For particularly impressive performances, the editor might award additional gifts, crowns, valuable objects, or even grants of freedom for enslaved gladiators. The adulation of tens of thousands of spectators celebrating a skillful victory represented the moment of maximum glory, the instant when a gladiator's training, courage, and skill earned public recognition. The arena experience was physically and psychologically intense for gladiators. The combination of mortal danger, exhausting physical exertion, overwhelming sensory input, and the knowledge that tens of thousands watched every movement created extraordinary pressure. Those who performed well under these conditions demonstrated remarkable mental strength, along with physical skill. Some gladiators thrived in the arena environment. These fighters seemed to elevate their performance when the stakes were highest, displaying showmanship alongside combat skill. They understood that they were performing for an audience, and that entertainment value mattered as much as pure fighting ability. The great celebrity gladiators possessed this performance quality, combining skill with the ability to engage and excite spectators. Others, despite adequate training and competence, struggled with the psychological demands. The pressure of public performance, the fear of death, or simply bad luck led to disappointing performances that ended careers quickly. The arena was merciless to those who couldn't handle its demands, whether through lack of skill, bad fortune, or insufficient mental fortitude. The aftermath of combat varied by outcome. Victorious gladiators returned to the Ludus as heroes, their status within the school elevated. They received better treatment, potential monetary rewards, and the satisfaction of survival. Defeated fighters who received mercy limped back to recover and eventually fight again, though with the knowledge that they had already failed once publicly. Those who died were buried in gladiatorial cemeteries, their bones showing the injuries that ended their lives. The records of individual gladiators were carefully tracked. Victory tallies, fighting styles, and notable achievements were recorded and publicised. These records formed the basis of gladiatorial celebrity, with successful fighters building reputations through accumulated victories. The equivalent of modern sports statistics existed in Roman times, with fighting records determining which gladiators commanded premium appearance fees and drew the largest crowds. Graffiti from Pompeii preserves some of these records. Flammus Acuta lived 30 years, fought 34 times, won 21, stood to draw 9, reprieved 4 times, a Syrian by nationality. Reads one inscription, providing a statistical summary of a career that spanned 13 years of arena combat. Such records circulated verbally and in written form, creating the data that fans used to debate favourites and make wagering decisions. The Amphitheater was where training met testing, where potential became reality or died trying. It was the stage on which gladiatorial celebrity was created through performance under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Those who succeeded repeatedly in this environment achieved fame not through luck, but through demonstrable superiority in their brutal profession. The arena made stars of some while consuming others, creating heroes and legends through mechanisms that modern celebrity culture would recognise: spectacular public performance, audience judgment, and the accumulation of victories that established reputations. Understanding the amphitheatre experience reveals that gladiatorial combat was carefully staged entertainment rather than chaotic violence. Every aspect served to maximise dramatic impact and emotional engagement. The result was spectacle that held audiences transfixed and created conditions where exceptional individuals could distinguish themselves enough to achieve widespread fame despite their degraded social status. Behind the spectacular violence and public celebrity was a sophisticated business infrastructure that financed, organised and profited from gladiatorial combat. Understanding the economics reveals that the games represented major industry, involving substantial capital investment, complex logistics, and calculations of profit and loss. The business structures both enabled gladiatorial celebrity and shaped its limits. The lanista, the owner-manager of a gladiatorial school, occupied the central business role. These entrepreneurs purchased enslaved people and condemned criminals, trained them as gladiators, and rented them out for games. The Lannister's business model involved upfront capital investment in purchasing and training fighters, ongoing expenses for feeding, housing and medical care, and revenues from appearance fees paid by game sponsors. The financial calculations were complex. Quality enslaved people suitable for gladiatorial training were expensive, particularly those with physical attributes suggesting fighting potential. Training a novice into a competent gladiator took months or years, during which the investment generated no return while requiring continuous feeding and housing expenses. The risk of death or serious injury during training meant that not all investments reached productive stages. Once trained, gladiators generated revenue when rented for appearances. The appearance fees varied based on the gladiator's record, reputation, and the prestige of the games. A celebrated gladiator with many victories commanded premium fees, while novices fought for much less. The Lannister's profit came from the difference between operating costs and appearance fees, which could be substantial if the school maintained many successful fighters. The risk management involved was significant. Each combat appearance risked losing the investment entirely if the gladiator died. Even victories could result in injuries requiring months of recovery, during which the fighter generated no income while still consuming resources. The Lannister had to balance maximising revenue by scheduling profitable appearances against preserving valuable investments by avoiding excessive risk. Insurance contracts existed to partially mitigate death risks. Sponsors purchasing gladiators for games might pay insurance premiums that would compensate the Lannister if fighters died in the arena. These contracts shifted some financial risk from owners to sponsors, though the terms varied and disputes arose over whether particular deaths qualified for compensation. The existence of these insurance arrangements shows the sophistication of gladiatorial business practices. The sponsors of games, the editors, faced their own economic calculations. Hosting gladiatorial games was extraordinarily expensive, consuming resources that might otherwise be invested productively. Yet the political benefits could justify the costs for those seeking popularity and power. A successful game-enhanced reputation earned goodwill from citizens and demonstrated the wealth necessary for political credibility in Roman society. Emperors sponsored the largest and most expensive games, using gladiatorial spectacles to maintain popular support and display imperial magnificence. The costs were absorbed by the imperial treasury, which extracted wealth from across the empire to fund Roman entertainments. The political calculus for emperors was straightforward. Keeping Rome's masses entertained and fed was essential for maintaining stability and preventing unrest. Wealthy private individuals sponsored games to honour deceased family members, fulfil religious obligations, or advance political careers. These sponsors had to carefully calculate costs against expected political returns. Overspending could bankrupt families, as happened occasionally when ambitious individuals borrowed heavily to finance spectacular games that would advance their political prospects. The financial risks were real, though for successful politicians the investment paid dividends through electoral success and official appointments. The equipment costs alone were substantial. Quality armour, weapons and protective gear were expensive to produce and maintain. The elaborate helmets, shields, and other equipment needed constant repair after combat use. The variety of gladiatorial types meant that schools and sponsors needed extensive inventories of specialised equipment. The metalwork required skilled craftsmen whose services commanded appropriate fees. The supporting personnel represented another major expense. Beyond the Lannistae and Doctoraes, gladiatorial enterprises employed armourers, weapon makers, medical staff, cooks, guards, administrative staff, and the labourers who maintained facilities. A large ludus might employ dozens or even hundreds of people beyond the gladiators themselves. All these workers expected compensation, adding to operational costs. The exotic animals featured in morning hunts were extremely expensive to obtain, transport, and maintain. Lions, leopards, bears, crocodiles, elephants, and other creatures were imported from distant provinces at enormous cost. Many animals died during transport, and those that survived required feeding and care until their arena appearances. The cost was so high that only the wealthiest sponsors could afford the most impressive animal displays. The economic scale of the gladiatorial industry created opportunities for various ancillary businesses. Merchants sold food and drinks to spectators at amphitheaters. Gamblers organised betting on combat outcomes. Souvenir vendors hawked gladiator-themed merchandise. prostitutes worked the crowds before and after games, the games generated economic activity extending far beyond the arena itself. The merchandise industry surrounding popular gladiators was substantial and diverse. Gladiator images appeared on pottery, lamps, glass vessels, and decorative items sold throughout the empire. These consumer goods allowed people to express fandom for favourite fighters while providing the images their celebrity status. The production and distribution of this merchandise created economic opportunities for craftsmen and merchants while spreading gladiatorial fame geographically and socially. Small figurines of famous gladiators, made from clay or metal, were popular toys and collectibles. These miniatures allow modern archaeologists to identify different gladiatorial types through their distinctive equipment and postures. The widespread distribution of these figures across the empire testifies to the broad appeal of gladiatorial culture and the economic opportunities it created for manufacturers. The gambling economy surrounding gladiatorial combat was extensive. Spectators wagered on fight outcomes, with betting occurring both casually among friends and through more organised bookmaking operations. The amounts wagered could be substantial, particularly when famous gladiators fought. The betting added financial stake to spectator engagement, increasing emotional investment in outcomes and generating additional economic activity around the games. The medical profession benefited from gladiatorial combat. Doctors gained valuable surgical experience treating traumatic injuries that occurred rarely in normal practice, but regularly in gladiatorial training and combat. The physicians who became skilled at treating gladiators could command high fees for their services, both from gladiatorial schools and from wealthy private patients impressed by their expertise. The burial and funeral industry dealt with gladiatorial dead. Gladiator cemeteries, like the one excavated at Ephesus in Turkey, reveal organised burial practices for fighters who died in training or combat. The costs of burial, whether borne by the lanista, the gladiator's family if he had one, or by gladiatorial associations that members contributed to, represented another economic dimension of the system. Gladiatorial associations, called collegia, functioned as something between modern unions and burial societies. Members contributed regular payments that funded social events, mutual support, and funeral expenses for deceased members. These organisations gave gladiators some collective identity and rudimentary support structures outside the official Ludus system. The existence of these associations shows that gladiators, despite their degraded status, organised to protect collective interests. The economics of retirement and freedom represented the ultimate financial transaction in a gladiator's career. For enslaved gladiators, winning freedom, the manumission, required either the generosity of their owner or accumulating enough money to purchase their freedom. Some gladiators did accumulate savings from prizes and gifts received after victories. The amount required for self-purchase varied, but it was substantial, requiring years of successful fighting and careful saving. Once freed, ex-gladiators faced economic challenges. Their gladiatorial past stigmatized them permanently, making many normal economic activities difficult. Some became trainers, leveraging their expertise to teach new generations of fighters. Others might operate small businesses or work in occupations that didn't require respectability. The economic opportunities for freedmen were always constrained by their pasts, even if they had achieved fame and relative wealth during their fighting careers. The economic structure created perverse incentives throughout the system. Lannister wanted gladiators to survive and win, increasing their value for future rentals, but also needed to risk them in combat to generate revenue. Sponsors wanted dramatic contests that pleased crowds, which sometimes meant encouraging fights to the death, even for skilled gladiators. Gladiators themselves wanted to survive and earn freedom, but achieving that goal required fighting repeatedly with all the attendant risks. The tension between these competing interests was managed through the customs and regulations governing gladiatorial combat, but never perfectly. The economic pressures meant that gladiators' lives were always balanced against financial considerations. They were simultaneously valuable assets to be protected and renewable resources to be exploited. The business of blood treated human lives as commodities, calculating their worth in financial terms and accepting their destruction as cost of doing business. Understanding the economics reveals that gladiatorial celebrity existed within carefully structured business contexts. The famous gladiators who achieved widespread recognition did so while generating profits for Lannister. drawing audiences for sponsors and contributing to the extensive economic ecosystem surrounding the games. Their celebrity was both a personal achievement and an economic asset, valuable to multiple parties who had financial interests in maintaining and exploiting it. The sophisticated business structures supporting gladiatorial combat show Roman organisational capability and their willingness to systematise even brutal entertainment for maximum efficiency and profit. The games weren't chaotic violence, but rather carefully managed business operations where every aspect, from training to equipment to scheduling to insurance, was calculated for optimal economic and entertainment results. Within this system, the gladiators who became celebrities represented peak performers whose exceptional abilities generated above-average returns on investment while capturing public imagination in ways that transcended mere economic value. Perhaps nothing about gladiatorial celebrity was more paradoxical than the intense sexual desire they provoked, particularly among women of all social classes. These men, who occupied the lowest social ranks and whose profession involved ritualized killing, simultaneously became objects of erotic fascination that scandalized respectable society while reflecting deep tensions about masculinity, danger, and desire in Roman culture. Understanding the sexual dimensions of gladiatorial celebrity reveals the complex and often contradictory Roman attitudes toward bodies, power, and sexuality. The evidence for women's attraction to gladiators is extensive and comes from multiple sources. Literary texts by poets, satirists, and historians frequently mentioned women's inappropriate desire for gladiators, usually disapprovingly. Graffiti from Pompeii and other sites recorded women's admiration for particular fighters, sometimes in explicitly sexual terms. Archaeological evidence from jewellery, amulets, and other personal items featuring gladiator images suggests that women carried symbols of favourite fighters close to their bodies. Legal texts addressed the scandal of upper-class women having affairs with gladiators, attempting to prohibit or punish such relationships. Juvenal, the Roman satirist writing in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries CE, devoted an entire poem to women's moral failings, including extended passages about a senator's wife named Epia, who abandoned her husband and children to run away with a gladiator named Sergius. Juvenal's description dripped with contempt for both the woman and the gladiator, but it revealed the reality of such attractions even while condemning them. Whether Epia was a real person or a literary construct, the story resonated because it reflected recognised social phenomena. Pompeian graffiti provided more direct, less literary evidence. Celadus the Thracian makes all the girls sigh, read one inscription. Another called a gladiator suspirium decurionum puellarum, the heartthrob of girls. These weren't sophisticated literary compositions, but casual expressions of popular sentiment, the ancient equivalent of fan worship. The fact that people took time to scratch these messages into walls shows that gladiatorial sexuality was topic of public conversation and expression. The sources of gladiators' sexual appeal were multiple and complex. The most obvious was physical. Gladiators were athletes with highly developed muscular physiques honed through intensive training. In societies where most men performed sedentary work or light labour, the gladiator's body represented an ideal of masculine physical development. The exposure of gladiators' bodies during combat, fighting with minimal clothing or in armour that emphasised muscular development, displayed physicality that was simultaneously aesthetic and powerful. The association with danger added another layer of appeal. Gladiators faced death regularly and survived through courage, skill, and strength. This proximity to violence and death created an aura of dangerous masculinity that contrasted with the safe, domesticated masculinity of respectable husbands and fathers. For women whose lives were carefully controlled and restricted, the gladiator represented forbidden excitement and danger. The social transgression involved in desiring gladiators was itself part of the appeal. These men were socially untouchable, polluted by their profession and their status as enslaved people or infames. For respectable women to admit attraction to gladiators was to acknowledge desires that violated every social norm. The forbidden nature of the attraction likely intensified it for some women, adding the thrill of transgression to physical attraction. The performative aspect of gladiatorial combat also contributed. Gladiators were performers displaying their bodies and abilities before massive audiences. The theatrical presentation, the careful choreography of the games, the dramatic life and death stakes, all created entertainment that was simultaneously athletic competition, theatre, and public execution. The performance dimensions added layers of spectatorship and desire, with women able to admire gladiators from the safety of the crowd while fantasizing about more direct contact. The power dynamics were complex and contradictory. Gladiators were powerful in the sense of physical capability and combat prowess, yet powerless in terms of social status and legal rights. They could dominate opponents in the arena, but were themselves dominated by owners, sponsors, and the broader social system. This combination of power and powerlessness, dominance and submission, may have been erotically appealing, allowing fantasies that combined admiration for strength with the comfort that these men ultimately posed no real social threat. Gladiator sweat and blood were considered to have erotic and cosmetic properties. Women collected gladiator sweat in small bottles, using it as aphrodisiac or skin treatment. Pliny the Elder, writing his natural history in the 1st century CE, mentioned that gladiator blood was believed to cure epilepsy when drunk warm, and that women used it in cosmetic preparations. These beliefs suggest that gladiators' bodies were thought to possess special properties that could be transferred through bodily fluids. The collection and use of gladiator sweat and blood reflected beliefs about bodily essences and their transferability. In the magical thinking common in Roman popular culture, physical contact with powerful bodies could confer some of that power. Women who used gladiator sweat as perfume or skin treatment weren't just admiring from afar, but attempting to literally incorporate gladiatorial essence into their own bodies. The practice combined erotic desire with magical thinking in ways that revealed Roman attitudes about bodies, power, and sympathetic magic. The actual sexual encounters between women and gladiators, when they occurred, involved significant social risks for the women. A respectable married woman discovered in an affair with a gladiator faced divorce, loss of property, social ostracism, and potential legal penalties. Even unmarried women risked reputational destruction. Despite these risks, affairs apparently occurred with enough frequency that they became recognized social problems requiring legal attention. Senatorial decrees attempted to prohibit senators' wives and daughters from having sexual contact with gladiators, suggesting that the problem affected even the higher social ranks. The penalties for violation were severe, potentially including loss of social status for the women and death for the gladiators. Yet the necessity of repeated legislation suggests that prohibitions were often ineffective, with desire overcoming legal and social barriers. For gladiators, sexual relationships with high-status women offered both pleasures and dangers. The attention and desire of aristocratic women must have been flattering and provided some compensation for their degraded status. Yet they had minimal control over such situations and faced severe punishment if caught. A gladiator who received sexual attention from his owner's wife or from another powerful woman had to navigate carefully, neither rejecting advances that might anger powerful people nor pursuing them aggressively enough to create scandal. Lower-class women had more freedom to pursue gladiators without the same level of scandal. Prostitutes, tavern workers, and other women of low status could consort with gladiators without destroying reputations that were already marginal. Some gladiators may have formed actual romantic relationships with women from similar social backgrounds, relationships that existed outside the scandalous affairs that preoccupied moralists and satirists. Male spectators' relationship to gladiatorial physicality was also complex. Roman men admired gladiatorial bodies and combat prowess, while maintaining that they themselves would never consider the profession. The homosocial dimension of watching nearly naked men fight was not explicitly acknowledged as erotic by the sources, yet the intense attention to gladiatorial bodies and the elaborate discussion of their physical attributes suggest that male viewing pleasure had erotic dimensions that weren't openly articulated. The homosexual aspects of Roman culture generally involved age-differentiated relationships, where adult men were attracted to adolescent boys, and penetration determined masculine status. Gladiators were adult men whose penetration by viewers was impossible, yet the pleasure of watching their bodies in action was nonetheless real. The erotic pleasure was channeled into approved forms: admiration of martial prowess, appreciation of athletic skill, identification with fighters representing masculine ideals. Sexual humour surrounding gladiators was common in literature and popular culture. Gladiatorial weapons and fighting styles provided rich material for sexual innuendo. The retiarius' net and trident were compared to erotic fishing for partners. The sword was an obvious phallic symbol. The various postures of combat were compared to sexual positions. This sexualization of violence and weaponry shows the close connections between violence and sexuality in Roman imagination. The children born from relationships between women and gladiators faced particular social challenges. These offspring of polluted fathers inherited social stigma that could affect their entire lives. The stain of gladiatorial parentage was hard to remove, following children into adulthood and limiting their opportunities. Yet such children were born, evidence that relationships between gladiators and women, while condemned, nonetheless occurred with some regularity. The sexual dimension of gladiatorial celebrity reveals fundamental tensions in Roman gender relations and sexuality. Women were supposed to be modestly confined to domestic spaces, their sexuality controlled by fathers and husbands. Yet gladiators provided objects of desire that escaped approved channels. The transgressive nature of these desires threatened patriarchal control, suggesting that women's sexuality couldn't be completely contained even in a society dedicated to controlling it. For men, gladiators represented ideal masculinity in physical terms, while simultaneously embodying everything men feared becoming socially. The admiration was always tinged with contempt. The recognition of gladiatorial excellence always paired with assertion of social superiority. This ambivalence reflected anxieties about masculinity, violence, and status that ran deep in Roman culture. Understanding the sexual dimensions enriches appreciation for gladiatorial celebrities' complexity. These men weren't simply fighters entertaining crowds, but also erotic objects whose bodies and performances provoked desires that challenged social norms and revealed contradictions in Roman attitudes toward gender, sexuality, power, and propriety. The celebrity they achieved had sexual components that were essential to its intensity, and that made it particularly troubling to Roman moralists trying to maintain social order. The sexual appeal of gladiators was inseparable from their other forms of celebrity. The fame, the physical prowess, the association with danger, the performative display of bodies, all combined to create figures who captivated public imagination at multiple levels, including the erotic. This multidimensional appeal explains how men from the lowest social ranks could become cultural icons, whose influence extended into the most private dimensions of Roman life. While most gladiators lived and died in relative obscurity, a select few achieved fame that transcended the arena and survived in historical memory. These individuals, through exceptional skill, memorable personalities, or unusual stories, became legendary figures whose names were known across the empire and whose exploits were discussed centuries later. Examining specific famous gladiators reveals the paths to celebrity and the characteristics that distinguished legends from ordinary fighters. Spartacus stands as the most famous gladiator in history, though his fame derives less from arena exploits than from his leadership of the massive slave rebellion that bore his name. Spartacus was a Thracian who served in the Roman auxiliary forces before deserting, being captured, and being sold into gladiatorial training at Capua. In 73 BCE, he and approximately 70 other gladiators escaped from their Ludus, seizing kitchen knives and makeshift weapons to fight their way to freedom. The escaped gladiators established a camp on Mount Vesuvius, where they were joined by thousands of enslaved agricultural workers fleeing from estates throughout Campania. Spartacus emerged as military leader of this growing force, which defeated several Roman armies sent to suppress the rebellion. The slave army swelled to perhaps 70,000 to 120,000 fighters at its peak, defeating Roman legions in multiple engagements and terrorizing Italy for 2 years. Spartacus's military talent was genuine and impressive. He outmaneuvered Roman commanders, used terrain skillfully, and maintained discipline among his diverse force. His goal appears to have been escape from Italy rather than overthrowing Rome itself, but circumstances prevented the rebels from leaving the peninsula. Eventually Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest and most ambitious politicians, took command of the suppression effort with multiple legions. The rebellion ended in 71 BCE at the Battle of the Sila River in southern Italy, where Spartacus's forces were destroyed. Spartacus himself died in the battle, fighting to the end rather than surrendering. The captured rebels were treated with exemplary brutality. 6,000 were bound to death along the Appian Way from Capua to Rome, their bodies left to rot as warnings to others contemplating rebellion. Spartacus became a figure of enduring fascination, representing resistance to oppression and the threat enslaved people posed to Roman order. While he achieved little arena fame during his brief gladiatorial career, his military exploits elevated him to legendary status. Later eras, particularly 19th and 20th century revolutionary movements, embraced Spartacus as a symbol of resistance to tyranny, though the historical figure was quite different from these romanticised versions. Flamma, mentioned earlier, achieved fame through sheer longevity and fighting record. This Syrian gladiator fought 34 times over approximately 13 years, winning 21 contests, fighting to draws 9 times, and receiving mercy 4 times despite defeats. He was offered freedom, the Ludus, on 4 occasions but refused it each time, choosing to continue fighting. This unusual decision suggests that Flamma found meaning, identity or satisfaction in gladiatorial life that freedom couldn't provide. Flamma's record was commemorated in an inscription found at Sicily, indicating that his fame extended beyond his original Ludus. The epitaph's survival shows that his achievements merited permanent record, and that someone, whether fellow gladiators, admirers or his owner, considered him worth memorialising. The decision to refuse freedom multiple times made Flamma unusual and memorable, defying expectations about what gladiators wanted. The refusal of freedom raises questions about gladiatorial psychology and identity. For some fighters, particularly those who had achieved success and celebrity, gladiatorial life provided status, purpose and accomplishment unavailable elsewhere. As a freed Syrian in Roman society, Flamma would have faced discrimination, economic challenges and social marginalisation. As a successful gladiator, he was respected within his community, materially comfortable, and celebrated for his achievements. The choice to remain suggests that the benefits of gladiatorial celebrity outweighed freedom's dubious advantages for a man in his position. Carpophorus specialised in animal combat rather than gladiator versus gladiator contests. This bestiarius gained fame for his exceptional success against dangerous animals, reportedly destroying a bear, lion and leopard in a single appearance, and dispatching various other creatures throughout his career. The specific numbers mentioned in sources are probably exaggerated, but Carpophorus clearly achieved renown as an animal fighter during the reign of Domitian in the late 1st century CE. Animal fighters occupied an ambiguous position in gladiatorial hierarchy. They were specialists whose skills differed from traditional gladiatorial combat, but whose courage in facing dangerous beasts earned admiration. Carpophorus's fame demonstrates that multiple paths to gladiatorial celebrity existed beyond the standard fighter categories. His success against exotic and dangerous animals provided spectacular entertainment that audiences valued and remembered. Marcus Attilius was unusual as a free volunteer gladiator who achieved rapid success. As a Tiro, a novice, he supposedly defeated 2 veterans, Hilarus and Ratius Felix, in successive bouts. Graffiti from Pompeii commemorated these victories, indicating that Attilius's rapid rise from newcomer to giant killer captured public imagination. The fact that he was a free volunteer rather than enslaved or condemned added to his story's appeal, suggesting that his choice to fight demonstrated courage rather than desperation. Attilius's story, if accurate, shows that exceptional talent could produce rapid celebrity. Defeating experienced gladiators as a novice was remarkable enough to earn lasting commemoration. The victories also validated the decision to become a gladiator, showing that free men could achieve distinction in the profession despite its stigma. Whether Attilius continued fighting successfully or died in subsequent contests is unknown, but his early victories earned him a place in gladiatorial lore. Spiculus was a gladiator favoured by the Emperor Nero, who showered him with gifts and honours unusual for someone of gladiatorial status. According to the historian Suetonius, Nero granted Spiculus properties and furnished residences, demonstrating favour that elevated the gladiator far above his legal status. When Nero faced death during the civil war of 68 to 69 CE, he allegedly called for Spiculus to come and execute him, preferring to die by the hand of a gladiator he admired rather than by assassination or suicide. Spiculus couldn't be found in time, and Nero died by his own hand. Spiculus's relationship with Nero demonstrates how imperial favour could elevate individual gladiators to extraordinary positions. While Spiculus remained legally infamous with all the limitations that status entailed, Nero's patronage gave him wealth and privilege beyond most free citizens. The relationship also shows the personal connections that could develop between emperors and gladiators, crossing social boundaries that were supposedly absolute. The favour shown to Spiculus was controversial, and contributed to negative assessments of Nero's character in ancient sources. For an emperor to elevate a gladiator so dramatically violated Roman sensibilities about proper social hierarchies. The criticism reveals that while gladiatorial celebrity was real and powerful, it remained bounded by social rules that even emperors were expected to respect. Nero's violation of these rules added to the perception that he was an inappropriate and dangerous emperor. Verus and Priscus fought each other during the inaugural games for the Colosseum under Titus in 80 CE. Their contest was so evenly matched, and both fighters displayed such skill and courage, that Titus granted both of them missio simultaneously, declaring them both victors, and granting them freedom as a reward for their exceptional performance. The poet martial commemorated the fight in his Liber Spectacularum, ensuring that their fame survived. The double grant of missio and freedom was apparently unprecedented, making the contest memorable. The story exemplifies the ideal gladiatorial contest. Two skilled fighters demonstrating excellence in a dramatic, evenly matched battle that ended not in death, but in mutual honour. This represented the highest expression of gladiatorial values: courage, skill, and the ability to transcend death through exceptional performance. Commodus presents perhaps the strangest case of gladiatorial celebrity. This Roman emperor, who ruled from 180 to 192 CE, personally fought as a gladiator, appearing in the arena on hundreds of occasions according to ancient sources. He always won, as one might expect when the emperor himself fights, and his opponents were either carefully selected to lose or killed if they threatened to defeat him. Commodus's gladiatorial activity scandalized respectable Romans, who saw it as degrading to imperial dignity. Commodus identified with Hercules and appeared in the arena dressed as the mythological hero. His fights weren't typical gladiatorial contests, but staged exhibitions where the emperor could display martial prowess against carefully managed opposition. The performances combined propaganda, entertainment, and the emperor's personal fantasy of being a warrior hero. The ancient sources uniformly condemned Commodus's gladiatorial activity as evidence of his unfitness to rule. The case of Commodus shows the limits of gladiatorial celebrity. Even an emperor who chose to fight as a gladiator couldn't make the profession respectable or escape its stigma. The activities that earned ordinary gladiators fame and admiration brought shame and criticism when performed by someone who should have maintained appropriate imperial dignity. The inversion of social norms, with the highest status person in Rome taking on the lowest profession, created scandal rather than celebration. Female gladiators existed, though in much smaller numbers than male fighters. These women, called gladiatrix, appeared in arena combat, and apparently drew curious audiences interested in the novelty of women fighting. The evidence includes inscriptions, some artistic representations, and literary references. A famous relief from Halicarnassus shows two female gladiators, Amazon and Achillea, fighting each other, with both apparently granted missio after an honourable contest. Female gladiators were controversial, and seem to have been viewed even more negatively than their male counterparts. The combination of female participation in violence, the exposure of female bodies in public, and the inversion of gender expectations made gladiatrices subjects of particular scandal. Gladiatorial combat was understood as an expression of masculinity, and women's participation violated fundamental assumptions about gender roles and proper female behaviour. The Emperor Septimius Severus banned female gladiatorial combat in 200 CE, apparently finding it inappropriate and scandalous. The ban suggests that female gladiators were not just theoretical possibilities, but actually appeared often enough to merit official prohibition. The mixed reception of gladiatrices, with curiosity about the novelty balanced against disgust at gender transgression, prevented female fighters from achieving the celebrity status their male counterparts sometimes enjoyed. These individual stories and others preserved in inscriptions, graffiti and literature show the paths to gladiatorial fame. Exceptional skill was the most reliable route, with fighters who consistently won and displayed courage, earning recognition and acclaim. Unusual stories or characteristics could also create celebrity. The volunteer who succeeded against veterans, the fighter who refused freedom, the animal specialist who destroyed dozens of dangerous beasts. Imperial favour could elevate a gladiator artificially, though such elevation was controversial. The famous gladiators represented a tiny fraction of the thousands who fought and died in arenas across the empire. Most fighters achieved no lasting fame, living and dying in obscurity with only their immediate communities aware of their existence. The famous few were exceptional, whether through superior ability, unique circumstances, or simply the luck of having their stories preserved through written commemoration. Yet their celebrity demonstrates that genuine fame was possible even from the lowest social starting point, if one possessed the right combination of skill, courage, showmanship, and fortune. Understanding individual famous gladiators reveals the human dimension of gladiatorial celebrity. These weren't abstract phenomena, but specific individuals with names, stories, and accomplishments. They were real people who lived in specific times and places, who trained and fought and sometimes died in pursuit of fame, money, or simply survival. Their stories, fragmentary as they often are, provide glimpses of the lived reality behind the institution, and show that even in the brutal world of gladiatorial combat, individual personality and achievement could shine through. The influence of gladiators extended far beyond the amphitheater into every corner of Roman culture. Their images, names, and personas penetrated art, literature, language, and daily life throughout the empire, creating a gladiatorial culture that touched virtually every Roman, regardless of social class or personal interest in the games. Understanding this cultural permeation reveals how thoroughly gladiatorial combat shaped Roman imagination and identity. Visual representations of gladiators appeared everywhere in Roman material culture. Mosaics decorating wealthy homes frequently featured gladiatorial scenes, with detailed depictions of different fighter types engaged in combat. These mosaics demonstrated the homeowners' appreciation for the games while displaying their wealth through expensive decorative programs. The quality of some surviving mosaics shows that the artist had deep knowledge of gladiatorial equipment and fighting styles, creating accurate rather than merely generic representations. Pottery and lamps bearing gladiatorial imagery were manufactured and sold throughout the empire. These everyday objects brought gladiatorial iconography into ordinary homes, where people used gladiator-decorated vessels for eating, drinking, and lighting. The mass production of these items indicates sustained demand across social classes. Even people who couldn't afford expensive mosaics could purchase modestly priced pottery featuring favourite fighters or generic gladiatorial scenes. Glass vessels, both drinking glasses and decorative pieces, also featured gladiatorial themes. Some glasses included inscribed names of specific gladiators, suggesting they were created as commemorative pieces for fans of particular fighters. Others showed combat scenes or individual fighters in action poses. The variety and distribution of these vessels shows that gladiatorial culture permeated material life at multiple social levels. The toy figures of gladiators, already mentioned, deserve additional emphasis for their role in transmitting gladiatorial culture to children. These miniatures, found throughout Roman archaeological contexts, show that children's play incorporated gladiatorial themes, and that parents purchased gladiator toys for their offspring. The socialisation of children into gladiatorial culture began early, normalising the games and their violence as part of ordinary Roman life. Board games incorporating gladiatorial themes existed, allowing people to simulate arena combat as entertainment. Some games involved moving gladiator pieces around boards according to dice rolls or other randomising mechanics, with combat resolved through various game mechanics. These games provided entertainment while keeping gladiatorial culture present in leisure activities, beyond actual attendance at games. Graffiti from Pompeii and other sites reveals the pervasiveness of gladiatorial discussion in daily life. Beyond the celebratory messages about specific fighters already mentioned, graffiti recorded fight predictions, debated fighters' relative merits, announced upcoming games, and discussed recent contests. The casual, spontaneous nature of graffiti suggests that gladiatorial topics arose naturally in everyday conversation and that people felt moved to record their opinions permanently. Literary references to gladiators appeared across genres. Historians included gladiatorial games in their narratives when discussing emperors and public life. Poets used gladiatorial imagery as metaphors for various human experiences, from romantic conquest to philosophical struggles. Satirists mocked society's obsession with gladiators, while simultaneously demonstrating that obsession's reality. Philosophers debated the ethics and effects of gladiatorial violence, revealing cultural anxiety even as they acknowledged the game's popularity. Gladiatorial vocabulary entered Latin language in metaphorical senses. Terms derived from the arena were applied to political struggles, military conflicts, and personal rivalries. The language of combat provided a rich source of metaphors for Roman writers describing any kind of contest or confrontation. This linguistic borrowing shows how thoroughly gladiatorial culture penetrated Roman thinking, providing conceptual frameworks for understanding diverse situations. Medical texts drew on gladiatorial examples when discussing injuries and treatments. Galen's work referenced his experience treating gladiators extensively, using these cases to illustrate medical principles. The text's audience, physicians who treated ordinary patients, found gladiatorial references comprehensible and useful, indicating that gladiatorial injuries and experiences were common reference points in medical discourse. Religious and funerary contexts incorporated gladiatorial elements. Some tombs featured reliefs of gladiatorial combats, possibly representing games held in the deceased's honour. Votive offerings at temples sometimes included gladiatorial imagery. The integration of gladiatorial themes into religious and commemorative contexts shows that the games had spiritual and memorial dimensions beyond mere entertainment. Fashion and appearance were influenced by gladiatorial style. Certain haircuts and clothing styles associated with gladiators were adopted by non-gladiators seeking to appropriate gladiatorial masculinity and danger. The adoption of these styles by free citizens shows both the appeal of gladiatorial aesthetic and the anxiety it produced in moralists who saw respectable people imitating their social inferiors. Food and dining culture incorporated gladiatorial themes. Banquets might include entertainment by people dressed as gladiators, performing mock combats for guests. Some elaborate dishes were sculpted or arranged to represent gladiatorial scenes. The association of gladiatorial imagery with hospitality and celebration shows the game's penetration into social life beyond the amphitheater. Sexual culture, already discussed regarding women's attraction to gladiators, included additional dimensions. Prostitutes sometimes adopted gladiatorial names or advertised associations with gladiators. Sexual acts were named after gladiatorial positions or moves, creating an erotic vocabulary drawn from the arena. These connections show how thoroughly gladiatorial culture permeated even the most intimate aspects of Roman life. The architectural influence extended beyond amphitheatres themselves. Roman cities throughout the empire constructed amphitheatres, usually as civic priorities ranking alongside temples, forums and baths. The presence of an amphitheatre marked a city as properly Roman, a participant in empire-wide culture. The building of these structures represented enormous civic investment, demonstrating how central gladiatorial culture was to Roman identity. Provincial elites adopted gladiatorial sponsorship as a way to display Romanization and curry favour with imperial authorities. Local notables sponsored games in provincial cities, mimicking metropolitan practices and connecting their communities to broader Roman culture. The spread of gladiatorial games throughout the empire, even to regions with different cultural traditions, shows the game's power as markers of Roman identity. The Christian opposition to gladiatorial games, which developed gradually during late antiquity, reveals the game's cultural significance through the intensity of resistance required to end them. Early Christian writers condemned the games as immoral and incompatible with Christian values. Despite this opposition, gladiatorial contests continued for decades, after Christianity became the empire's official religion, showing the cultural strength of gladiatorial tradition. The final abolition of gladiatorial games, traditionally attributed to the Emperor Honorius, in 404 CE, after a monk's martyrdom attempting to stop a contest, actually occurred gradually over the early 5th century. Different regions banned games at different times, and animal hunts continued longer than gladiatorial combat proper. The prolonged process of abolition demonstrates how deeply embedded the games were in Roman culture, and how difficult it was to eliminate them despite religious and imperial authority aligned against them. The cultural legacy of gladiators extended well beyond the ancient world. Medieval and Renaissance Europeans were fascinated by Roman gladiatorial culture, with artistic representations appearing in manuscript illustrations and early printed books. The rediscovery of Roman sites, including amphitheaters and gladiatorial artifacts, renewed interest in later centuries. The romantic idealization of gladiators as heroic figures fighting for freedom emerged, though it bore little relation to historical reality. Modern popular culture has embraced gladiatorial imagery enthusiastically. Films, television shows, novels, and video games set in ancient Rome almost inevitably feature gladiatorial combat prominently. The gladiator has become a stock figure in popular imagination, representing a particular type of masculine heroism and spectacular violence. The modern fascination shows both continuity with ancient attitudes and significant differences in how violence and entertainment are understood. The cultural impact of gladiators in their own time reveals a society where these stigmatized fighters simultaneously represented ideals and anxieties. They embodied masculine courage, physical prowess, and willingness to face death, values Romans celebrated. Yet they also represented social pollution, degradation of free status through voluntary enslavement, and the brutal violence that civilized Romans claimed distinguished them from barbarians. The tension between celebration and condemnation, between admiration and disgust, ran throughout gladiatorial culture. Understanding this cultural impact shows that gladiatorial celebrity wasn't confined to the arena or to moments of combat. It permeated daily life through images on household objects, conversations recorded in graffiti, fashion choices, linguistic metaphors, and countless other manifestations. Romans couldn't escape gladiatorial culture even if they wanted to, as it was woven into the fabric of their world at every level, from imperial spectacle to children's toys. The pervasiveness of gladiatorial culture both reflected and reinforced the game's importance. As images and references multiplied, they normalized gladiatorial violence and made it part of ordinary experience. Children growing up surrounded by gladiatorial imagery internalized it as natural and normal. Adults negotiated its meanings and implications throughout their lives. The culture sustained the institution, while the institution generated more culture in a self-reinforcing cycle that lasted for centuries. As the sun sets on the ancient world and the last echoes of arena combat fade into history, reflection on gladiatorial celebrity reveals a phenomenon that was simultaneously unique to Rome, and illustrative of universal patterns in human culture. The contradictions that defined gladiatorial fame, the simultaneous honour and shame, attraction and repulsion, celebration and condemnation, illuminate fundamental tensions in Roman society, while also revealing truths about celebrity, violence and entertainment that transcend particular historical moments. The paradox of gladiatorial status stands at the centre of any understanding. These men occupied the absolute lowest legal and social positions, yet achieved fame rivaling emperors and generals. They were simultaneously the most degraded and the most celebrated, the least respectable and the most desired. This contradiction wasn't accidental, but rather reflected deep ambivalence in Roman culture about violence, masculinity, slavery, and social hierarchy. The Romans valued martial virtue and military prowess as central to their identity and success. Gladiators embodied idealized versions of these martial values, displaying courage, skill, and willingness to face death that resonated with Roman military culture. Yet the Romans also valued social order, maintaining clear hierarchies, distinguishing free from enslaved, citizen from foreigner, honourable from dishonourable. Gladiators threatened these hierarchies by achieving fame from degraded positions. The celebrity gladiators achieved was genuine by any standard. Their names were known throughout the empire. Their images appeared on countless objects. Women desired them despite overwhelming social prohibition. Children played with their effigies. Ordinary people scratched their names on walls and debated their merits. This fame resulted from real achievements, from demonstrable skill and courage displayed repeatedly under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Yet the fame came with no social elevation. A gladiator who had won 50 fights remained infamous with all the legal and social disabilities that status entailed. He couldn't vote, hold office, or testify in certain legal proceedings. He was permanently stained by his profession, marked as socially polluted in ways that couldn't be washed away by fame or achievement. The celebrity existed alongside and despite the degraded status, creating a unique form of fame that acknowledged achievement while denying dignity. The mechanisms of gladiatorial celebrity will seem familiar to contemporary observers. The training system that created professional specialists, the public performances where skill was displayed and judged, the accumulation of victories building reputations, the merchandise and endorsements allowing fans to express support, the sexual dimension, making fighters objects of desire. All these have parallels in modern celebrity culture. The specific content differs, but the structures through which fame is created and maintained show remarkable continuity. The business infrastructure supporting gladiatorial celebrity also anticipates modern entertainment industries. The complex financial arrangements, the management of human assets, the calculations of risk and reward, the merchandising opportunities, the gambling economies, all these reveal sophisticated commercial organisation devoted to extracting profit from public interest in watching skilled performers. The gladiatorial industry was big business, and celebrity was both its product and its marketing tool. The sexual dimension of gladiatorial fame, particularly the desire they provoked despite their degraded status, reveals tensions about masculinity, danger, and transgression that remain relevant. The attraction to dangerous, socially inappropriate men who combined physical prowess with forbidden status created fantasies that challenged respectable social norms. The women who desired gladiators were rejecting, or at least questioning, the safe, domesticated masculinity of respectable husbands, in favour of something more primal and dangerous. The individual stories of famous gladiators, from Spartacus's rebellion to Flamma's refusal of freedom to the unknown fighters commemorated in graffiti, show that these were real people with agency, personality, and individual choices within their constrained circumstances. They weren't merely victims of a brutal system or abstract examples of Roman cultural contradictions, though they were also those things. They were human beings navigating impossible situations, finding meaning and sometimes achieving genuine glory, despite the system's brutal indifference to their lives. The cultural pervasiveness of gladiatorial imagery and themes shows how thoroughly the games shaped Roman imagination and identity. Gladiators weren't marginal figures, but central icons whose presence pervaded material culture, language, literature, and daily life. The investment in gladiatorial culture, both economic and emotional, was enormous and reflected genuinely held values about courage, skill, and the entertainment value of watching skilled violence. The violence itself, which modern sensibilities find disturbing, was central to gladiatorial appeal and cannot be minimized or sanitized. Romans enjoyed watching people fight and sometimes die. They found entertainment in the spectacle of human destruction, in the skill displayed in combat, and in the drama of uncertain outcomes. This attraction to violent spectacle challenges comfortable narratives about human progress and moral improvement across history. Yet the violence was also ritualized, controlled, and constrained within specific contexts. It wasn't random chaos, but carefully organized entertainment, following elaborate rules and customs. The distinction between gladiatorial combat and murder was real to Romans, even if it seems arbitrary to modern observers. The ritual framing made the violence acceptable, even entertaining, in ways that the same violence outside the arena context would not have been. The eventual end of gladiatorial combat under Christian influence represents genuine moral change, though one should be careful about overstating Christianity's role or uniqueness. The Christian rejection of gladiatorial violence as morally wrong and spiritually corrupting did represent a significant ethical shift. Yet the actual abolition required more than moral argument, relying also on economic pressures, political calculations, and cultural changes that would have affected the games regardless of Christian opposition. The legacy of gladiatorial celebrity extends into the present through the continued fascination with gladiators in popular culture. Films, books, and video games about gladiators remain popular, though they typically romanticize and sanitize the historical reality. The modern gladiator figure embodies certain ideals about courage, physical prowess, and heroic resistance to oppression that have more to do with contemporary values than with Roman reality. The comparison between gladiatorial celebrity and modern athletic or entertainment celebrity reveals both continuities and differences. modern athletes achieve fame through skill, displayed in public performances, accumulate statistics and records that fans debate, and become objects of commercial exploitation and sexual desire, all paralleling gladiatorial patterns. Yet modern athletes aren't enslaved, aren't facing death, and aren't stigmatized by their profession. The fame mechanisms are similar while the human stakes are dramatically different. The ethical questions gladiatorial celebrity raises remain relevant. How should societies treat people who perform dangerous or violent activities for entertainment? What responsibilities do audiences have for the consequences of their entertainment choices? How do fame and celebrity interact with human dignity and worth? These questions had different answers in Rome than in contemporary society, but they persist as genuine dilemmas requiring ongoing consideration. Understanding gladiatorial celebrity enriches appreciation for both Roman civilization's complexity and human culture's diversity. The Romans created a society that could maintain brutal entertainment alongside sophisticated law, degraded gladiators while celebrating their achievements, and ritualized violence while valuing civic peace. The contradictions don't resolve cleanly, but rather reveal a culture grappling with fundamental questions about violence, entertainment, social order, and human worth. The gladiator stands as one of history's most distinctive and revealing figures, enslaved yet famous, degraded yet desired, despised yet celebrated. The gladiator embodied contradictions that made him endlessly fascinating to Romans and continue to fascinate observers 2 millennia later. The celebrity achieved from such depths, through such violence, in such a rigidly hierarchical society, represents a uniquely Roman phenomenon that nonetheless illuminates universal aspects of how fame, entertainment, and human achievement intersect. The crowds who gathered in amphitheaters across the empire, cheering for favourites and jeering opponents, experiencing the visceral thrill of watching skilled combat, were responding to basic human impulses toward competition, spectacle, and the controlled experience of danger through others' performance. That these impulses were channeled through an institution requiring human enslavement and ritualized killing shows both the power of those impulses and the moral limits of Roman civilization. As darkness falls completely over the ancient world, as the last gladiator takes his final bow, and the amphitheatres fall silent forever, the legacy remains. The images, stories, and names of gladiators survived their era, carrying forward into subsequent ages as symbols of courage, tragedy, entertainment, and the complex relationship between violence and civilization. In studying their strange celebrity, we learn not just about Rome, but about the enduring human fascination with those who face death for our entertainment, and about the moral ambiguities that arise when fame, violence, and social hierarchy intersect. The gladiator achieved celebrity because Romans needed him to, because their society created space for him to become famous, despite every social barrier working against him, because his performances met psychological and cultural needs that respectable society couldn't fulfill. Understanding that need, and the contradictory ways Romans responded to it, reveals a civilization in all its sophisticated complexity, moral ambiguity, and ultimate humanity. The gladiator's celebrity was Rome's creation, and in creating it, Rome revealed itself.